In the high desert of Oregon, in the year of our Lord 1888, the dust knew a truth the town of Sagebrush only guessed at. The truth was that Silas Thorne, a man carved from the unforgiving landscape he claimed, had buried 2 wives and driven away 9 more women who had come to answer his advertisement for a third. They came seeking security and left with tales of a silence as vast and crushing as the sky, of a man whose heart was a locked box buried under acres of rock and regret. The world called him a lost cause, a widower twice over, a man doomed to the solitary company of his 2 half-wild children and the ghosts that walked his land. But what the world, in its haste and judgment, didn't know was that the 10th woman was coming. Not a hopeful girl with wedding quilts in her trunk, but a woman the world had already finished with. This is her story, a tale of what the world called used and useless, and what one man in the vast quiet of the desert would come to learn was worth more than water, more than land, more than redemption itself. Her name was Elspeth Finch. She was 55 years old, a schoolteacher dismissed from her post in a green Ohio valley for the unforgivable sin of aging. Her hands were marked with ink and chalk, not flour and lye, and the only dowry she possessed was a spine of quiet dignity and a small, worn volume of verse tucked into her valise. She was not answering an advertisement for a wife. She was answering one for a governess and housekeeper, a position of service, a final port in the storm of her own obsolescence. The stagecoach left her on the edge of town, a collection of sun-bleached buildings huddled against the wind. Dust coated her black traveling dress, settled in the lines around her eyes. She did not look for welcome in the faces that peered from the mercantile window. She had long ago stopped expecting it. She looked for the man, Silas Thorne. He was there, by the water trough, his back to her, a tall man made of angles and weathered hickory. He did not turn when the stage pulled away, leaving her in a cloud of grit. He finished watering his horse, his movements deliberate, economical. Only then did he face her. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they held no welcome. They held an assessment. He looked at her graying hair, pinned in a severe bun, at the sensible black boots peeking from beneath her hem, at the hands clasped before her, still and waiting. He said, his voice rough, like stones grinding together, "You are the woman, from the letter." It was not a question. "I am Elspeth Finch," she replied, her own voice steady, though her heart beat a nervous rhythm against her ribs. He gave a single, sharp nod. He took her valise, his calloused fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. There was no spark, no jolt of recognition the romance novels described. There was only the feel of rough, dry skin against her own, the feel of work, the feel of survival. He did not offer his arm. He simply turned and started toward a wagon laden with supplies. "The children are waiting," he said, not looking back to see if she followed. Elspeth Finch straightened her shoulders, took a breath of the dry, sage-scented air, and followed him into the vast, indifferent silence of his world. The transaction had been made. She was the 10th woman. But she was not here to be a wife. She was here to work. And in that, she hoped, she might find a different kind of salvation. The kind that came not from being chosen, but from being necessary. The journey to his homestead was a lesson in emptiness. The wagon wheels cut through a sea of grey-green sagebrush that stretched to a horizon blurred by heat. The sky was a merciless, bleached blue. There were no gentle hills, no meandering streams like the ones she had left behind in Ohio. There were only jutting basalt cliffs, the shimmer of distant alkali flats, and the constant, whispering wind that seemed to be telling a story of everything that had ever been lost. Silas Thorne did not speak. He drove the team with a quiet competence, his gaze fixed on the faint track ahead. He seemed a part of the landscape, his stillness matching that of the ancient rocks, his silence a reflection of the endless sky. Elspeth sat beside him on the hard wagon seat, her hands folded in her lap, her posture erect. She observed. It was what she had always done. She noted the way the hawks circled on the thermals, the way the light changed the color of the distant mountains from lavender to deep violet, the way Silas's hands on the reins were never still, making constant, minute adjustments. They were capable hands, scarred and browned by the sun, the nails blunt and clean. They were not the hands of a brute, but of a man who did battle with the earth every day and only sometimes won. After 2 hours that felt like a lifetime, a cluster of buildings appeared, not rising from the land so much as clinging to it. A small, unpainted cabin, a sturdy-looking barn, and a web of corrals. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a lonely grey ribbon against the blue. This was his kingdom. A kingdom of dust and labour. 2 children stood on the porch of the cabin, unsmiling. A boy of perhaps 10, with his father's serious eyes, and a girl a few years younger, her hair a tangled, sun-streaked mane. They watched the wagon approach with the wary stillness of wild creatures. They were Caleb and Ruth. Silas pulled the team to a halt. "We are here," he stated, the words as spare as the land itself. He swung down and began unhitching the horses without another glance at her. The unspoken message was clear. "This is your domain now. See to it." Elspeth climbed down from the wagon, her bones aching. The children did not move. Their eyes, one pair a stormy grey, the other a cautious brown, followed her every step. They were his first 2 wives' children, she knew. A son from the first, a daughter from the second. 2 halves of 2 different losses, now her responsibility. "Hello," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "I am Miss Finch." The boy, Caleb, just stared. The girl, Ruth, hid behind his shoulder. Elspeth did not press them. She turned her attention to the house. It was not a home. It was a shelter, a functional space for sleeping and eating, and little more. Inside, the main room was dim, smelling of wood smoke, bacon grease, and something else, a faint, lingering scent of neglect. A rough-hewn table and benches stood in the center. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. Dishes were stacked haphazardly near a wash basin. A fine layer of dust coated everything, a testament to the losing battle against the desert outside. This was the silence the other women had fled, not just the absence of conversation, but the absence of life, of softness, of care. It was a house that had forgotten how to be a home. Elspeth looked at the dusty floor, the unadorned walls, the wary children in the doorway. She had been brought here to impose order, to teach letters and sums, to cook and to clean. A simple list of duties. But standing there, in the heart of Silas Thorne's desolate world, she understood her task was far greater. She was here to wage a quiet war against the emptiness. She untied the ribbons of her bonnet, rolled up the sleeves of her dress, and began. The first battle would be with the dust. The first week was a silent trial. Elspeth rose before dawn, the chill of the high desert seeping through the floorboards of her small partitioned room. She moved through the house with a quiet efficiency that was its own form of language. She did not ask Silas where things were. She found them. She did not complain about the primitive stove or the pump that required a strong arm. She mastered them. Her days were a litany of labor. She scrubbed the floors with lye soap until the raw pine gleamed. She washed every dish, every pot, every piece of cutlery, and arranged them on shelves she had wiped clean. She aired out the musty bedding, beating the dust from it with a grim satisfaction. She found a rhythm in the work, a purpose that silenced the whispering voice of her own failure. In Ohio, she had been dismissed as old. Here, her age was a repository of knowledge. She knew how to render lard, how to make bread that rose high and light, how to mend a shirt so the stitches were nearly invisible. Silas watched her. He never spoke a word of praise, but his eyes followed her as she moved about the cabin. He saw the way she organized his chaotic pantry, the way she saved bacon drippings in a clean jar, the way she banked the fire at night so the coals would still be warm in the morning. These were the small, invisible arts of a woman who knew how to make a life out of meager materials. The 9 women before her had either complained of the hardship or tried to fill the silence with nervous chatter. Elspeth Finch did neither. She simply worked, her presence a steady, quiet hum in the house that had been silent for too long. The children were her second front. Caleb was sullen and watchful, his loyalty to the memory of his mother a shield against this newcomer. Ruth was timid, a little ghost who flitted at the edges of the room. Elspeth did not force herself upon them. She set their lessons at the table after the breakfast dishes were cleared. She taught them their letters and numbers with the same patient resolve she applied to scrubbing a pot. For days, they resisted. Caleb would give clipped, monosyllabic answers. Ruth would only whisper, her eyes downcast. Elspeth did not scold or cajole. She simply continued, her voice a calm, even current in the tense little room. She laid out the books. She sharpened the pencils. She waited. The break came not with words, but with a book. One evening, after the simple meal of beans and cornbread was finished, Elspeth took her own small volume from her valise. It was poetry, a collection of verses about the seasons, about the sea, about things these desert children had never known. She did not ask their permission. She simply opened it and began to read. Her voice, trained by years in the classroom, filled the cabin. It was not loud, but it was clear and resonant. She read of autumn leaves and winter snow, of ships at sail on a boundless ocean. Silas sat in his chair by the fire, ostensibly mending a piece of tack, but his hands had stilled. Caleb, who had been carving a piece of wood, lowered his knife. Ruth crept closer, her small face rapt, her eyes wide with a hunger for a world beyond the dust and sage. Elspeth read until her throat was dry. When she closed the book, the silence that returned was different. It was not empty. It was filled with pictures, with possibilities. She had not filled the silence with chatter. She had filled it with stories. The next day, when she set out the school books, Caleb did not glower. He picked up his pencil. Ruth, for the first time, looked her directly in the eye and asked, in a small, clear voice, "Will you read again tonight, Miss Finch?" Elspeth felt a stirring in her chest, a warmth she had not felt in years. It was a small victory, a tiny seed planted in the hard, dry soil of this family. "Yes," she said, "I will." Silas, coming in from the barn, heard the exchange. He said nothing, but he did not go to his chair by the fire. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching this quiet woman who had begun, stitch by silent stitch, to mend the frayed edges of his world. The days shortened, and the sun's warmth became a fleeting gift. The high desert air grew teeth. It was a time of preparation, of shoring up defenses against the coming cold. It was during this time that Elspeth's worth ceased to be measured in clean floors and edible meals, and became something far more fundamental. It began with the water pump. The handle, a piece of crudely forged iron, had always been loose. One morning, with the air so cold it hurt to breathe, it finally broke. A clean snap, the metal groaning in protest. Silas swore, a rare outburst of frustration. The well was their lifeline. A trip to town for a new part would take 2 days, time he could not spare with winter bearing down. He stood over the broken pieces, his face a mask of grim resignation. Elspeth came out, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She looked at the pump, at the 2 pieces of metal lying in the dirt. She did not offer advice. She simply watched him for a moment, then went to the barn. She returned not with words of sympathy, but with a length of baling wire and a small hammer. Silas looked at her, his expression a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "That won't hold," he said. "It might hold for a time," she replied, her voice calm. "If it is braced." She knelt in the cold dirt, her fingers, surprisingly nimble, beginning to work. She showed him how to lash the 2 pieces together, using a small flat rock as a splint. She directed him to wrap the wire, tight and precise, creating a crosshatch of support. Her knowledge was not theoretical, It was practical, born of a childhood on a farm where nothing was ever thrown away if it could be mended. He found himself following her instructions, his large, powerful hands moving to the rhythm of her quiet commands. Together, they fixed the handle. It was an ugly, makeshift repair, but when Silas worked the pump, water gushed forth, clear and cold. He looked at the water, then at the wire and rock brace, and then at Elspeth. She was rubbing her cold hands together, a faint smudge of grease on her cheek. He saw her then, not as a housekeeper, not as an aging spinster. He saw a woman of profound and surprising competence, a woman who did not panic, who did not defer, but who saw a problem and quietly, methodically, sought a solution. "It will hold," he said. And in those 3 words, there was a universe of respect. Later that week, a more serious crisis arose. One of the mares, a sturdy buckskin that was Silas's best breeding stock, went into a difficult labor. For a day and a night, the animal strained and suffered. Silas worked tirelessly, his face etched with worry. A lost foal was a blow. A lost mare was a disaster. Elspeth brought him coffee and bread, which he ignored. She watched from the barn doorway, her heart aching for the suffering animal and for the man who fought so hard to save her. The women before her would have retreated to the house, leaving the grim business of birth and death to the man. But Elspeth had seen this before. On the second morning, when Silas was near exhaustion and the mare's struggles were weakening, Elspeth walked into the barn. She carried a bucket of warm water and clean rags. "Let me help," she said. It was not a request. He was too tired to argue. He stepped back and she took his place. She spoke to the mare in a low, soothing murmur, her hands gentle but firm as she examined the animal. "The foal is turned," she said, her voice a clinical calm in the tense air. "I can feel a leg." For the next hour, she worked with a skill and patience that stunned him. She showed him how to attach a rope, how to pull with the mare's contractions, never against them. Her movements were sure, her knowledge deep and instinctual. It was a bloody, messy, primal business, but Elspeth was unflinching. She was not a delicate townswoman. She was a force of nature in her own right, her quiet determination a match for the life and death struggle unfolding in the straw. At last, with a final shuddering groan from the mare, the foal was born. It lay steaming in the cold air, a perfect, long-legged creature. The mare, exhausted but alive, immediately began to nuzzle her offspring. Silas leaned against the barn wall, the tension draining from him, leaving him hollow. He looked at Elspeth. Her dress was ruined, her arms smeared to the elbows, but her face was serene. In her eyes, there was not pride, but a deep, abiding satisfaction. He had hired her to teach his children and keep his house. He had expected her to be fragile, to break against the hardness of this life as the others had. Instead, she had saved his pump. She had saved his mare. She had met the harsh reality of his world and had not flinched. She had proven herself not just useful, but vital. He walked over to her, took one of her soiled hands in his. He said nothing. He simply held it for a moment, his thumb gently stroking the back of her wrist. It was a gesture of profound gratitude, an acknowledgement that went deeper than words. She had not come here to be a wife, but she was becoming something more. She was becoming a partner. And for the first time since his second wife had died, Silas Thorne did not feel entirely alone. Winter descended not as a gentle blanket, but as a siege. Snow buried the sagebrush, and the wind howled down from the mountains, a lonely, keening sound that scraped at the soul. The world shrank to the dimensions of the cabin, the barn, and the short, frozen path between them. They were isolated, a tiny island of warmth and light in a vast, white wilderness. For the 9 women before, this enforced intimacy had been the breaking point. The silence of one man, amplified by the silence of the snow, had become unbearable. They had grown frantic, their chatter turning desperate, their presence shrinking until they were nothing but a nervous vibration in the room. But for Elspeth, the winter brought a strange kind of peace. The rhythms of their lives intertwined. The day was governed by the needs of the fire, the animals, and the stomach. In the morning, Silas would clear a path to the barn, his broad back a dark shape against the blinding white. Elspeth would have coffee hot on the stove, the smell a welcome promise against the cold. The children, unable to play outside, bent over their lessons at the table, their world now centered on the stories Elspeth read and the sums she taught. A subtle shift occurred in Silas. He had always been a man of action, not words, but now his actions began to speak a new language. He noticed the draft that came from under her door and plugged it with rags. He saw her squinting to read by the dim lamplight and fashioned a reflector from a piece of polished tin to brighten her corner. He carved a small, smooth bird from a piece of scrap wood and left it on Ruth's pillow. He mended the spine of Caleb's worn reader with a piece of soft leather. These were small things, gestures as quiet as the falling snow, but they were not the actions of a mere employer. They were the actions of a man who was paying attention, a man who was beginning to care. Evenings became the heart of their day. After the chores were done and the simple supper cleared away, the family, for they were, in these moments, a family, would gather by the fire. Elspeth would read, her voice weaving tales of faraway places, of courage and kindness. Silas would sit in his customary chair, his hands busy with some small task, but his attention was fixed on her. He watched the firelight play on her face, softening the lines of weariness and age, revealing the quiet strength beneath. He listened to her voice, a steady melody against the counterpoint of the wind. He began to see the beauty in her that the world had overlooked. It was not the fleeting beauty of youth, but the enduring beauty of resilience. It was in her capable hands, which could soothe a feverish child, mend a broken harness, and turn the pages of a book with equal grace. It was in her eyes, which held no illusions, but were filled with a deep, unwavering calm. It was in her presence, which had transformed his shelter from a place of grim survival into a haven of quiet warmth. One night, the wind was particularly fierce, rattling the window panes and sending gusts of smoke down the chimney. Ruth, startled by the noise, began to cry. Elspeth went to her, not with platitudes, but with a simple, comforting presence. She sat on the edge of the girl's cot and began to sing a lullaby, a soft, simple tune from her own childhood. Silas stopped his work. He watched as Elspeth's song quieted the child, her hand gently stroking Ruth's hair. In that moment, he felt a crack in the wall he had built around his heart. For years, he had believed that love was something you lost, a pain to be endured and then buried. He had sought a woman to perform a function, to fill a role. He had not expected to find a woman who could, with a simple song, begin to heal the broken places in his home and in himself. The world outside was cold and unforgiving, but inside the small cabin, something warm and fragile was beginning to grow. The thaw came in late March, a slow, grudging retreat of winter. The snow melted, revealing the pale, flattened grass, and the world turned to mud. With the opening of the roads came the mail rider, the first visitor they had seen in 4 months. He brought letters, newspapers, and a connection to the world they had forgotten. He also brought the past. There was a letter for Elspeth. The handwriting was sharp and angular, familiar and unwelcome. It was from her brother-in-law, the man who had inherited her husband's farm and had politely but firmly shown her the door. He was the voice of the world that had declared her finished. She took the letter with a hand that trembled slightly. She retreated to a small room to read it, needing privacy for what she knew would be an ordeal. Silas watched her go, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. He had grown accustomed to the placid surface of her composure. He had never seen it disturbed. The letter was worse than she had imagined. It was not enough that he had cast her out. Now he sought to assuage his own guilt by offering her a pittance, a charitable donation to see her through her old age, enclosed with the letter. He wrote of his own prosperity, of his children's successes. Every word was a reminder of the life she had lost, of the place she no longer had. The final lines were the cruelest. "We hope you have found a suitable, if humble, position. It is a blessing that there are places in this world for women of your circumstance." It was not kindness. It was pity. It was a dismissal. All the shame she had fought to keep at bay, all the feelings of worthlessness came flooding back. She sat on the edge of her bed, the letter and the small money order trembling in her hand, and the sturdy walls of her dignity crumbled. For the first time since arriving in this harsh land, Elspeth Finch wept. They were silent, bitter tears for a life that had deemed her disposable. She did not appear for the midday meal. Silas, worried by the unprecedented breach of routine, sent Caleb to knock on her door. The boy returned, his face troubled. "She said she's not hungry, Pa." Silas knew then that the letter was the cause. He stood for a long time in the center of the room, feeling a helpless anger. He did not know the contents of the letter, but he knew its effect. He saw the wound it had inflicted. He wanted to storm into her room and demand to know who had hurt her, to ride out and face them. But he was a man of the desert, and he knew that some storms had to be weathered, not fought. His response, when it came, was quiet and deeply practical. He went to the woodpile and spent the afternoon splitting and stacking wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a release for his frustration. He worked until his shoulders ached. Then he went inside. He took a bucket of fresh water to her door and left it there. He ladled up a bowl of the stew she had made the day before, rich with venison and winter vegetables, and placed it on a small tray with a piece of fresh bread. He set the tray on the floor outside her room. He did not knock. He did not speak. He simply left the offerings and returned to his chair by the fire. It was his way of speaking. "You are not alone. You are cared for. Here is water. Here is food. Here is strength." Hours later, the door creaked open. Elspeth emerged, her eyes red-rimmed but her back straight. She saw the tray, the empty bowl, the bucket of water that was no longer there. She looked at Silas, who sat watching the flames. Their eyes met across the quiet room. No words were exchanged. None were needed. He had not offered empty platitudes or pried into her sorrow. He had offered sustenance. He had offered respect for her privacy and a silent, steadfast presence. In his world, that was the equivalent of a vow. He was standing guard over her sorrow. She had come here seeking to be necessary. She was beginning to understand that she was also cherished. Spring arrived in a rush of green across the hills and a torrent of meltwater in the creeks. With it came new life, but also new threats. A man rode in from the east, a stranger in a city suit, his horse too fine for the rugged country. He was a representative from a land and water consortium based in Portland, and he carried with him a sheaf of official-looking documents. He claimed that the creek Silas depended on, the lifeblood of his small ranch, had been legally reappropriated. According to his maps and titles, the water rights now belonged to the consortium, which planned to dam it further upstream to irrigate vast tracts of land for speculation. Silas's claim, the man explained with a condescending smile, was based on an older, now defunct, territorial charter. He was, in short, trespassing on their water. The colour drained from Silas's face. The land was worthless without the creek. His father had filed the claim, had built the first small cabin on its banks. It was his entire world, the only legacy he had for his children. To lose the water was to lose everything. The man from the consortium gave him a choice: sell the land for a fraction of its value or be forced off by the courts. He gave him 30 days to decide. That night, a crushing despair settled over the cabin. Silas sat at the table, the legal papers spread before him, their dense, impenetrable language a wall he could not scale. He was a man of the earth, of seasons and livestock. He understood the language of the sky, but the language of lawyers was foreign and hostile. He saw his life's work, his father's work, slipping through his fingers like dry dust. Elspeth watched him, her heart aching. The children were huddled by the fire, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, their faces pinched with fear. The home she had so carefully begun to build was under threat. She rose from her chair and walked to the table. "May I?" she asked, her hand hovering over the documents. Silas looked up, his eyes hollow. He gave a weary nod. For the next 2 hours, Elspeth read. She did not skim. She read every word, her lips moving slightly, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her schoolteacher's mind, trained in precision and logic, passed the convoluted sentences, the clauses and subclauses. The cabin was silent but for the rustle of paper and the crackle of the fire. Finally, she looked up. "He is wrong," she said, her voice clear and firm. "Or he is lying." Silas stared at her. "What do you mean?" "This document," she said, tapping a finger on a specific page, "references the Territorial Water Act of 1879. But your father's claim was filed in 1875, under the Homestead Act and the prior riparian rights doctrine. This new act has a grandfather clause. Section 4, paragraph B. It explicitly protects all claims filed and actively worked for a period of more than 5 years prior to its passage." She looked him directly in the eye. "Your claim is older. It is stronger. They are trying to intimidate you because they think you cannot read this." A flicker of hope, the first in hours, sparked in Silas's chest. He had looked at those papers and seen defeat. She had looked at them and seen a path to victory. Her literacy, which he had once considered a simple tool for teaching his children, was now a weapon. It was a shield. "We will need a copy of the original claim from the territorial office in the Dalles," she continued, her mind already working, planning. "And a written response to this man and his consortium. I can draft it." He looked at her, truly looked at her, in that moment. This quiet, unassuming woman who had mended his home, healed his animals, and soothed his children, was now preparing to fight for their very existence. She was not just his housekeeper. She was his ally, his champion. "We will go to the Dalles," he said, his voice raw with an emotion he could not name. It was more than gratitude. It was awe. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Her fingers were cool, but her grip, when it tightened on his, was strong and sure. They were no longer a man with his employee. They were a partnership, forged in the crucible of this shared threat. They would face the world together. The journey to the Dalles was a pilgrimage. They left the children in the care of a neighbour, a grudging truce brokered by necessity. The two of them, Silas and Elspeth, rode side by side in the wagon, a silent, determined pair moving toward a confrontation. The world that had threatened to tear them apart had instead bound them together. In town, they were an oddity. The rough-hewn rancher and the woman in the severe black dress who walked with the confidence of a barrister. At the Territorial Land Office, a dusty, book-filled room run by a clerk with ink-stained fingers, Elspeth was the one who spoke. She requested the records with a calm authority that brooked no argument. Silas stood behind her, a silent, solid presence, his hand resting near the pistol on his hip, a clear statement that this woman was under his protection. The clerk, impressed by her knowledge of the specific statutes, found the original claim. It was exactly as she had predicted. Filed, sealed, and dated 1875. Solid as the basalt cliffs that lined the river. They paid for a certified copy. As they left the office, stepping back into the sunlight, Silas felt as though a physical weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He looked at Elspeth, at the quiet triumph in her eyes. That evening, in a small, clean room at the town boarding house, she drafted the letter. She did not use threats or angry words. She used the law. With meticulous precision, she cited the statutes, the dates, the clauses. She laid out their case with irrefutable logic. Her handwriting was a thing of elegant clarity, each letter perfectly formed, a stark contrast to the aggressive, arrogant scrawl of the consortium's documents. When she finished, she handed it to Silas to read. He followed the words with his finger, sounding them out under his breath. It was a masterpiece of controlled, legal force. It was a declaration of war, waged with ink and paper instead of bullets. "It is good," he said, his voice thick. He folded the letter, tucked it safely inside his coat. They walked to the post office to send it. The evening was cool, the sky a deep, star-dusted velvet. As they walked back, their footsteps echoing on the boardwalks, a comfortable silence settled between them. They had faced the dragon and discovered, together, that they had the means to defeat it. Outside the boarding house, under the yellow glow of a lantern, Silas stopped. He turned to face her. He reached out and took her hands in his. They were no longer the hands of a stranger, but hands he knew intimately, the hands that had saved his mare, mended his pump, held his children, and now had saved his home. "Elspeth," he said, speaking her given name for the first time. The sound of it, in his rough voice, was both strange and wonderful. "When we return, I would be honored if you would consent to be my wife." It was not a passionate declaration. It was a statement of fact, a truth that had been building quietly for months. He was not offering her a position. He was offering her a partnership, a name, a permanent place in his life. He was offering her a home, not as its keeper, but as its heart. Tears welled in Elspeth's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a profound, soul-deep joy. The world had told her she was finished, a woman of no value. But this man, this quiet, solitary man of the desert, had seen her. He had seen her worth. "Yes, Silas," she whispered. "Yes, I will." He did not kiss her. Instead, he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to her knuckles. It was a pledge, a promise made in the quiet of a dusty street, more binding than any shouted vow. They had come to town to fight for a piece of land. They would return to build a life upon it 5 years later. The sun, a benevolent gold, was setting behind the western mountains, painting the high desert in hues of rose and lavender. The cabin was no longer a simple box against the landscape. A porch had been added, and on it a sturdy rocking chair where Silas now sat. Beside the house, a garden flourished, a riot of green beans, sturdy squash, and bright red tomatoes, a testament to Elspeth's patient cultivation. A fence, straight and true, enclosed it, protecting it from deer. The house itself had been whitewashed, and blue curtains, sewn by Elspeth's own hand, hung in the windows. It was no longer a shelter. It was a home. Ruth, now a young lady of 14, sat on the porch steps, a book open in her lap. Her hair, no longer a wild tangle, was neatly braided. She was reading aloud, her voice clear and confident, to Caleb, who leaned against a porch post, mending a bridle. At 17, he had his father's height and quiet competence, but his eyes held a softness, a curiosity, that was a gift from the woman who had taught him to see worlds beyond their own valley. Elspeth came out of the house, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She had filled out, the harsh angles of her face softened by contentment. The grey in her hair shone like silver in the evening light. She handed a mug to Silas and sat in the chair beside him, her movements easy and familiar. They did not need to speak. Theirs was a communion that existed in the shared rhythm of their days, in the comfortable space between them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved object. It was a bird, a hawk, its wings outstretched as if riding a thermal. He had spent the winter evenings carving it from a piece of juniper wood. The detail was exquisite, each feather precisely rendered. He placed it in her hand. Her fingers closed around it, the wood smooth and warm. It was a love letter, carved in wood. "It's beautiful, Silas," she whispered. He just nodded, his gaze on the horizon. His land was safe. His children were thriving. His home was filled with a quiet, steady light. He had been a man surrounded by ghosts, lost in a silence of his own making. Elspeth had not banished the ghosts, but she had taught him how to live with them. She had not filled the silence with noise, but with peace. The world had sent him 9 women who saw only the hardship, the lack, the emptiness. Then it had sent him a 10th, a woman the world had deemed worthless. And she had seen the potential for a home, the need for a family, the strength in a quiet man. She had brought order, stories, and courage. She had brought life. Silas reached over and took her hand, his calloused palm fitting perfectly against hers. They sat together, watching the last of the light fade, the first stars appearing in the deep velvet sky. The world had called him a lost cause, and her a finished story. But here, in the vast, forgiving silence of the desert, they had found their beginning.